All right, hello students. Today we are going to talk about chapter 7 in the Stanovich book. It's kind of a short chapter, but we're going to talk about a lot more here in this lecture than it goes into in the book. There's a lot more on basic and applied research that I want to share, as well as on evaluation that goes beyond simply what's in the book. So with that, definitely read the chapter. It's very quick to read, but we'll go quite a bit beyond it today as well. So, the main crux of the first part of this chapter, anyway, is that natural environments aren't always needed for psychology studies or even studies in general. So, a lot of times scientists in general set up really controlled conditions. So, we've already talked a lot about experiments. So, we set up controlled conditions that are really unlike a natural environment. We oftentimes do that to get really good control over really specific variables, to see how one interacts with another in a very artificial way. And a criticism that we often see of science in general, and especially psychology, because we kind of get a better sense. We have a lot more like intuitive psychology that we feel we understand as we grow up and things like that. So it happens more in the field of psychology than, say, with physics, for example. So, but we do oftentimes set up really specific conditions to see specific variables and how they interact with each other in ways that are not natural, that wouldn't often happen in a natural setting, or that would be really unlikely or so rare to happen in a natural setting that you really need to control for these things to watch these things interact with each other. So it really allows us to separate a lot of the correlated variables. So when we're talking about prosocial behavior or happiness, there's a lot of variables that are related to those things. But if you're only interested in two variables relations to happiness, then you need to control for those other things, whether by measuring them, experimental manipulation. There's a lot of different ways to control for that. But a criticism is that when you do all that, well, it's not a natural environment. It's not real. It's not real life anymore. And, well, that's true. It's not real life anymore. But it doesn't mean that the findings that we get aren't valid and generalizable. So it depends on the kind of study that you're doing, what you're looking at. Is it basic research? Is it applied research? And we'll get to that in a little bit. With that, it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly natural to demonstrate what happens in a natural environment. So it's really difficult or impossible to investigate some specific kind of phenomena in natural conditions, or you might be waiting years to see the specific kind of example, and that's hard to collect a large amount of data if you're waiting years and years to get that kind of data. So a really good example of this is actually a particle accelerator. So that's what these two pictures are. So the particles will be emitted and go through this big figure eight, or like one will be accelerated here, one will be accelerated here, and then they collide at the sensors. And that's a really artificial environment. Yes, that can happen. It probably happened a ton at the very beginning of the universe. That's kind of the point of this, see how those kind of particles interact, to get a better sense of what was happening at the beginning with the Big Bang. So with that, though, you could set up these sensors, and they did in the past set up these kind of sensors to watch for those kinds of interactions. For example, to look for specific kinds of radiation, there's giant pools of water underground, and every once in a while specific kind of radiation will interact with that water, and they can watch how that happens. They have sensors for that. But rather than waiting for that just to happen, we can do it on purpose. We can create an artificial condition to see how these particles interact with each other. Similarly, with an experiment or with a correlational study that we're controlling for specific variables, we are controlling the environment in a way that we can watch two variables or three variables or however many variables interact with each other specifically. And depending on how we do that, we might be able to generalize that to real life, even though the setting that we researched it isn't at all real life. So the particle accelerator, it's a very unlikely event to have those kinds of particles interact with each other in that kind of setting. So we've created this artificial scenario to examine it. So that control and comparison are really important. So we talked about partialing out in our correlational chapter. We talked about the control over things in our experimental chapter. That partialing out the effect of one variable on another is really, really important. And you can do that statistically or experimentally. And that lets us look at these really specific relationships. So attachment and romantic relationships in later adulthood. We can look at pro-social behavior, volunteering, happiness, meaning in life. We can look at how symptoms of depression are affected by other mental illnesses that are occurring at the same time. So we can look at those kind of relationships in either an experimental way or a correlational way by partialing out and figuring out how A affects B, affects C, affects D, and all those kinds of things. So it's kind of complicated in some cases, but as we saw, a lot of the experiments and correlational partialing out can be pretty simple too. But that lets us get a better sense of just these variables on their own. So with this, artificial settings can be made real. I think I made this example when we were talking about methods a few weeks ago, that I had an advisor who was doing a study for the military, wanted to see the impacts of stress in actual wartime scenarios kind of thing. So they created a lab in a classroom. So essentially they took out all the desks and all the chairs. They put all the computers and things that they had on the ship's deck there, and they put the same monitors that they would have. I think it might have been a submarine too, so it was a little easier to like enclose the entire room and put the exact technology that they use. So these people that generally run the ship, they drove to the place. They knew it was a building that they were walking into, and they were told about the experiment. It wasn't there wasn't any deception there. They were told that they'd be presented scenarios that they might encounter during wartime, and they wanted to see what their stress responses were and how it affected teamwork, things like that. And then they went into this room that was made to look exactly like their actual ship's control center. So if they do that, they go through these scenarios, they see these things coming on the monitors, they're making decisions in the simulation, and while it was a very artificial scenario, the researchers were controlling exactly when certain things were happening to increase stress, to increase the need for teamwork and things like that. It was a very artificial setting, but it was made so real that their responses were very much like they would have been in real life. So they talked about that afterwards. The participants talked about it, that they completely forgot for a while that they were actually in a simulation. So it probably lasted, I forget, like 2 hours, an hour and a half or something like that. But during that time, because it was so realistic to them, it felt very real. So it was very controlled, it was a very artificial setting, but it seemed real. It was made real to them. So with this, some variables don't have to be looked at in a real life situation. Some of them act the same, whether they're in an artificial or a natural setting. So the particles colliding in this example, if they collide just naturally out in space, they'll interact the same way as they will in the little tube here. So yeah, you can look at that in a really artificial setting. You can control that there's not other particles interacting with them and things like that. The speed that they can travel, is it a complete vacuum or not? So getting that level of control is really, really useful. And it's the same thing for psychological variables. A lot of times our memory speed, or like how much our neurons fire, if it's in an artificial scenario, like we're sitting in an MRI, watching a video, like doing reaction time tests or something like that, our neurons firing is still going to be pretty much the same as if we had sensors on and someone was doing climbing or something like that. So your brain in many ways will work the same. So depending on what you're looking at, it's not going to matter if it's artificial or not. So, but you would need to know that from lit review and understanding the concepts. How much artificiality can you use to study these things? What have people done before? What do you think would actually work? And that goes into this control of natural environments. So remember also that science is a process. So multiple studies are going to be used to answer similar but slightly different questions over time. So with that, you'll do multiple studies to answer slightly different questions. So study A might have hypothesis A and B, and then after you find the answers to that, study 2 might have C and D, study 3 might have, what letter am I on? A, B, C, D, E, F, so on and so forth. So you're doing these studies, you publish your study, someone else says, okay, that brings up a new question. So hopefully you understand that from your lit review as well, that all this work has been done to now, what could be next steps in the field? And that's essentially what science is doing. Generally, it's not one big dramatic study that changes things and changes the paradigm. It's multiple similar studies that might be replicating in some ways, but just slightly building on each other as things go on. So study one, we talked about qualitative research. You might do a qualitative study, just get descriptive research, and have a little better understanding of what's going on. You might have an entirely artificial experiment for study two, where you think you know what's going on, so you control some variables and see how they interact. Then study three might be trying to apply those in the real world. So from this, we haven't talked about basic and applied research today, but all those three studies might be in one research paper. So based on the definitions in the book, it's over here, so based on, oh, it's not coming on, gotta hold it closer to my face. So based on the definitions in the book, study one, you might call study one, and maybe even study two, both basic research versus study three might be applied research. So altogether, this whole paper is some mix of basic and applied research. And so that's the process, is taking these steps to understand in more detail. So one thing we've talked about most of these samples before in artificiality criticisms. When we're considering how people interact and how variables interact, we are using people as samples, right? So even if we're looking at their brain, that brain is someone's brain, right? So oftentimes we've used weird samples. So the white, educated, industrialized, rich countries that are also democratic. So those are a lot of our samples in psychology. So that could be a problem depending on what you're studying. So I think we've covered this one in enough detail. I think we've touched on it like 2 or 3 times now. But weird samples are definitely something to be concerned about. Depending on what you're looking at, it won't matter if you're using white, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic people or any other people. Again, just depending on what variables you're looking at. So as an example of this, the Heroic Imagination Project that is trying to do activities to build heroism across the world. Recently, they've been reached out to by a group in India. And so the research that we've done on heroism has pretty much exclusively been, there's some in like Germany and Europe, but pretty much exclusively with people in the US. So that might be a very different context to the people in India. With that being said, we are having conversations with them, what things might translate over there, not just language translate, but what aspects of these activities might we be able to kind of copy and paste with new examples there, what things might need to be entirely changed. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about how do studies apply in other places. And so that's the best way to do, is basically talk to people who know the culture. Talking to someone like me who doesn't know the culture is probably a bad idea. I would just say, hey, we need to talk to someone who knows the culture, and we can communicate and figure out what can and cannot translate. So other samples that we've used, college students, volunteers. We talked about this a little bit in our experiment and our correlational study. There might be differences from volunteers to people who don't volunteer. You might be getting some skewed set of data because people who volunteer versus not volunteer might be slightly different. So with that, MTurk workers, another example, we've talked about them before, that they tend to not be making as much money, otherwise they wouldn't be working on MTurk. So they might be between jobs, or this might be a third job or a second job for them, things like that. So that's a little different than another sample that you might get. With that being said, getting MTurk workers statistically, demographically, tends to be a little better representation of at least the US than the weird samples of the college students and just a random sample of volunteers that you might get from your local city. But if all you want is to test something in your local city, getting the sample of volunteers from your local city might be the most appropriate thing to do. So it depends on your methods, it depends on your variables. In some cases, it's not going to matter what your sample is. In some cases, it's going to be absolutely essential what your sample is. If you only want to look at people in your local area, your sample should probably be coming from your local area. Otherwise, you're getting data from a sample, say an MTurk sample, that's not really as applicable to your local area as you could have gotten. So in general, with all these things being said, in general, a larger sample tends to be better. You get more people, more diversity, more responses, more range of data to be able to look at. And in general, a more representative sample works better. So even if you're looking at your local area, you want to get a good picture of what your local area looks like. So whether that's ethnicity, whether that's religion-wise, whatever it is that's relevant to your variables, you want to get a good representative sample of those kinds of things. All right, so let's move on to basic and applied research. So this is a question I would ask in class, and so I'll ask it here. Right now, probably in your notes, just put down the answer while I take a sip of coffee. But what is basic research? What is applied research? So hopefully you're writing down a definition based on how you understand them right now at this minute. And then after our class today, you can revise this definition and say, oh, here's some examples, here's how I would change this definition. That's a good thing to do for note-taking in general so that you learn the material better. So basic research is basically explanatory. It's knowledge for the sake of knowledge's sake. So you want to do this study just because you want to know things. And you want to explain, describe, and understand behaviors or mental processes, decision-making, things like that. Versus applied research is one of the biggest keys here, and the differences is that applied research is focused on a problem. So you have some sort of problem that you want to apply research to try and fix generally, or understand. So explaining the behavior in the context of that problem. So a good example is social problems. So what are the social problems that exist? Well, one that comes to mind pretty easily is people who are unhoused. So with people who are unhoused, what is that in context? Well, where do they live? What kind of resources are available to them? Are there resources available to them? How cold is it versus warm is it? What are the challenges that they face in the context that you're looking at them in? So that might look different here in Salt Lake City versus Los Angeles versus New York versus Miami, right? So all these places where people might be unhoused, you need to explain that behavior in context and focus on the problem that those people are, all the problems that those people are facing there. And then oftentimes applied research is modifying behaviors, so it doesn't have to be. So in that case of people being unhoused, we would probably try to change things so that people would have houses, and so that would modify things in the environment. So, but another example of applied research is trying to help people search for their purpose in life. So some of my research has been focused on that, or try to help people be more heroic, do more pro-social things. So that's trying to modify their behavior to do more pro-social things. So basic research, these are two distinctions that we'll kind of focus on for a little while, like what is the difference between these? And then in the end we'll kind of see that, oh, maybe this distinction isn't maybe necessarily so important, but that's kind of a spoiler warning, or a spoiler there. So basic research. Let's dive into this one on its own a little more in detail. All right, so basic research builds cumulative knowledge base. It's for getting knowledge. It's because you want to know things. You want to know things about some kind of area. All right, so basic research, you're trying to look at maybe basic knowledge of the universe, basic knowledge of human behavior, basic knowledge of how humans interact with each other, how social groups interact with each other, and you're generally trying to find it just to understand it, just to understand what things are going on. Generally, you're describing things. You're not necessarily prescribing how things should be. You're saying this is how things are, this is how this interacts with this, this is how intake of sugar affects diabetes, for example. But you're not prescribing, saying this is what you should do to reduce diabetes. That would be an example of basic versus applied. So generally it's very theory driven. You have the theory of developmental contextualism. You see how things interact with each other, so it drives how you do research to understand things better. So you take the theory and then from that you make your hypotheses. We've talked about that before. So with this, the purpose of this kind of research is to modify and advance theories, to understand things better, essentially. So generally for basic research, the questions are going to come from the researcher themselves. They've done a lit review. They understand the field in general. So you've now done lit reviews. You have probably at the end of your lit review future directions. These are ways that you could continue doing research. Some of your continuing research might be applied. Some of it might just be we still need answers to how these things interact with each other to better understand these phenomena. So generally with basic research, you're not making value judgments on anything, like you should do this or you shouldn't do this. Oftentimes, basic research is experimental, but it can also be qualitative. It can also just get a broad set of data. It can be correlational. You can do survey research, but oftentimes you're doing experiments with lots and lots and lots of control to see exactly how A affects B and is affected by C. So, in a very controlled experiment, for example. Generally, when you're disseminating or you're giving out this information that you find from basic research, you're giving that to journals, you're going to conferences, you're getting that to other scientists, pretty much exclusively. So with this, basic research doesn't set out intending to solve a problem. As we'll talk about, sometimes the solutions to problems are discovered through basic research, or when you go back through your lit review, you put things together and you're like, oh, this might be a solution. But originally, the basic research might not have been to solve a problem, or is generally not to solve a problem in and of itself. So, some examples of basic research questions are things like, how does a child process memories? So, how does that happen? How does that happen in childhood? What child temperaments exist? So, what are they? What is a child temperament? So, things like this. How should we characterize or categorize various attachment styles? So these are all kind of developmental focused, because I'm a developmental focused researcher. So how should we characterize and categorize attachment styles? So what are the different attachment styles? What should we name them? How are they different from one another? What are they related to? These are all basic research questions. So what does cognitive development look like in a 3-year-old? What's changing in their brain? What are they capable of? What are they perceiving and understanding, putting together? How does empathy develop? So with that question, you might be able to see if we know how empathy develops, maybe we can help other people become more empathetic. But the basic question of how does empathy develop, that's a basic research question. How do we understand this phenomena of empathy? So with this, let's move on to applied research. Remember, the big key here is a focus on problems. So oftentimes, but not always, it's offering solutions and trying to solve the problem. So you can see from these little comics that have been up. So basic science, this person is asking, why is this important? Applied science, how can I use this? So you might think of the distinction in that way too. So with applied research, oftentimes you're describing things, but also prescribing things. You're saying, okay, so this is how sugar intake is affecting diabetes, so we think or we prescribe that you should or should not do these kinds of behaviors. So it's taking that step forward to focusing on that problem or solutions or potential solutions to problems. So generally the researcher can make these questions, can say, hey, I wonder if I can make X, Y, or Z better, or we can change this, or we can make other people's attachment styles change, or something like that. Or you might see a problem first, like unhoused people, and try to use applied research to solve that problem. So the question can come from the researcher, or it can come from the problem in and of itself. So you want to solve the problem, that's your research question. How do I solve this problem? That kind of thing. Oftentimes, applied research is very much in context, so a problem is itself in context. So how do we change children's attachment styles? Well, a child is within a context. They're within their families, they're within an extended family, their neighborhood, their community, and that might look different from one child to another. How much of that is relevant to changing attachment styles? So in context. So with this, we often use applied research to try and understand problems, solve problems. We do use theory, obviously. All research, you're going to be doing lit reviews, you're going to be understanding all these variables in and of themselves and have some ideas of, okay, if we want to improve empathy, we should research empathy. We should have a good understanding of how empathy develops. So you're still informed by theory. You're informed by that developmental theory, by our understanding of empathy from before this. But you can also have this research driven by a theoretical social problems or questions. So like the being unhoused. So how can we solve that problem? So any other social problems. How can we change people's perceptions of other people's so that we don't have as much bias against people, for example. So how can we do that? Why do people do things to hurt other people in some cases? Why does authority seem to lead to that? And how can we change that? So some of the topics we've brought up a few times in previous research examples, you can see how that basic research can also be applied. So if we look back at like Milgram's study that we used as an example of obedience to authority, so he was trying to understand, well, what is the process by which people might do things against their conscience by being obedient to an authority? So he was doing basic research, trying to understand that concept. But we can see, oh, well, we can take what we know from that and help educate people and change that behavior in the future. So that part of it's applied. What Milgram was doing, you would call more basic research. So, and basic and applied research, one is not better than the other. One is, with that being said, for a lot of scientists and for a lot of history, basic research has had like maybe more of a pedestal, like understanding things and having a really clear understanding has maybe had a higher place in the ivory tower, but it's not necessarily the case as much anymore that it has such a high status to do just basic research. So oftentimes you'll start with that problem in applied research, and then you'll use the previous research that exists to try and solve the problem or suggest solutions, test solutions, things like that. With this, applied research still does build the cumulative knowledge base, or at least it can. Let's say you're very, very focused on one very specific problem in one very specific context that's not really going to apply to other people. Well, that's fine. You can still use applied research to solve the problem. What you learn might not really affect the broader knowledge base. It might not really be useful to write a paper to let other researchers know what you did, for example, because other places might be very different than where you did this. But it can be really effective. So applied research on how can we change people's purpose in life, or can we do that? That might be really relevant for people down the line who want to do a similar kind of program to help people change in some ways. So with this, as with basic research, basic researchers generally just publish to other scientists in journals and conferences. For applied researchers, they might go to journals and conferences as well, but because they're trying to solve problems, they will also go to the stakeholders that are involved in those problems. So teachers or other educators, policymakers, everyday people, they will try to get that information or disseminate it to those kinds of audiences who can use these solutions to these problems. So it's very connected also to evaluation and policy research. And so we'll talk about evaluation research in a minute. Policy research is basically applied research on policies. So does X, Y, or Z policy work? Comparing the policy here versus the policy here. The example that we used in quasi-experiments of the garbage program, that's an example of a policy. Did it work or did it not? We saw that specific one did not. So with that, applied research, evaluation, policy, they all kind of mix together as well. So we'll talk about how maybe these lines or distinctions between applied research, basic research, evaluation, policy aren't maybe as crisp and clear as we like to write about them in our textbooks. So with this, even in applied research, being able to generalize our results can be really important because the findings will be really applied in real life situations. So if you've solved some sort of problem or you're working to solve some problem, that's something in the real world that's happening. So you want to be able to generalize to other places that might be happening. All right, so some examples of applied research questions are: what factors contribute to a smaller achievement gap? So that's a really good applied question. Then we can maybe work on changing some of those. What type of pre-K leads to higher levels of school readiness? So that's a good applied question to help kids get ready for school. What interventions improve memory in 5-year-olds? So you're testing specific kind of activities or interventions or trainings to improve 5-year-olds' memory. So solve some specific problem. With that, you obviously need to understand how memory works in 5-year-olds, what cognitive things they should be capable of now. So you're going to use that basic research to help you answer this applied question. How can we increase empathy in 6-year-olds? So with that, again, you need to know the basic research of what should be happening empathy-wise here, what factors might be affecting it within context, and then maybe try and manipulate some of those things to boost empathy. So, while both types of research are important, the majority of research has been designed to test or modify theories, which we would call basic research, and this is kind of a holdover from many generations, basically, of scientists, kind of putting a little more emphasis on basic research. It might just be the spheres that I travel in the research world, but pretty much everybody that I'm involved with is doing a lot of applied and basic research at the same time. So in my own personal work, I don't see people doing a lot of just basic research, but they do exist. Those researchers do exist. It still does have a little bit in the ivory tower, like a little bit more status, but it's not as dramatic as it has been in 100 years ago, for example. So let's look at a model of how you might do research using even evaluation, policy, the research methods we've talked about to solve problems. So this is like a look at how to do research in the real world. So just kind of a visual model, I'll walk us through it. So the first piece is here. I probably should change some of these colors so it's a little easier to see. So socially significant problem identified. So think of some kind of social problem, maybe one of the examples we've already given, that you would like to see changed. Let's use maybe our last example in these. So how can we increase empathy in 6-year-olds? So we want to increase empathy in young people. Maybe we decide that their empathy is lower than we wish it was, or they're not getting enough training, or for some reason that's the problem we want to solve. We want to increase empathy in young people. So we do some lit review, right? We use things like theory and the understanding that we already have, and we do that applied research to solve the problem. So we look at previous research, we do a lit review, we see what's been tried before, we see how empathy develops in general, and then we take that and we go out in the real world. 6-year-olds, that's what, like first grade? I always forget the ages for the grades. But let's say it's first grade, so you would go and you'd ask teachers, you'd ask community people who might be involved with 6-year-olds, you'd collaborate, right? So people that are working with these children, maybe therapists, social psychologists or sociologists that are working with 6-year-olds as well. And then you might say, okay, well, in school, let's create some kind of intervention to boost empathy. Or in the home, let's create some kind of intervention to boost empathy in 6-year-olds. So you use these things that you know, these research methods, talking to these people about what would be possible, and then you try to change and boost their empathy. So after you find your results, so you've done 1, 2, 3, 4 studies, something like that, you find your results. So you disseminate those results to audiences. You're probably going to give those results, probably not the raw data with like student names and things like that, to the teachers, but let them know, hey, did this intervention work? Tell the families, hey, does this actually help? Did it work? Did it not work? The teachers, did this work? Did it not work? So you disseminate that to basic research maybe. Maybe you've learned something new about how empathy develops. Maybe you give it to policymakers. Hey, we should make these kind of courses required for first graders. And you give it to evaluators. Maybe you've done this in a private school, so you were doing an evaluation or something like that. So you're back here to saying, okay, we still have maybe this problem, maybe it didn't move as much as we wanted, something like that. So you do the same thing. You do additional studies. You work with people in the real world. You use the things you already know. You do your lit reviews. You know the research methods that might work. And you keep basically going through this cycle of trying to solve the problems. And hopefully, you do solve the problem. So you solve whatever problem that you're facing. You do boost young people's empathy. And then, great job. You've made the world a better place. So that's kind of the point of applied research and how I kind of see them working all together. And a big key part here is this whole middle circle is working with other people, using the things that you know, using the things that they know, using the research that's been done before, using research methods to do good tests, and trying to solve problems in different ways. Maybe all that needs to change is policies. So you do that and then you see if that works. So that's kind of the cycle of solving problems in applied science. All right, so with that, hopefully you've got a lot better idea of what basic versus applied research might look like. This would be a little pop quiz that you wouldn't get points for in class, but we'll do it here in this kind of setting. Look through these questions just in your notes, mark down which ones you think are basic or applied. On the next slide, I'll show you in blue are the ones that are a little more basic, green are the ones that are a little more applied. So take a minute to just jot down which ones you think are basic and which ones you think are applied. So as you look at these questions, feel free to go back to your notes, like flip back and see, based on the definitions of basic versus applied research questions, which ones you think fit better in different places. And also pause it now. I'm going to go to the next slide. If you haven't finished marking down which ones are which, pause it now and try to figure those out, and then I'll show you the answers. All right, so let's move on to what I would say the answers are. So the blue ones are more basic research questions. The green ones are a little more applied research questions. So what causes children to be shy? You're not really searching for a problem. You just want to understand this concept, so it's a little more basic. What teacher strategies reduce shy behaviors? So what can you actually do to change or modify behavior? That's a lot more of an applied question. How does shyness develop? Kind of like this first one. That's looking in general, what is happening in this phenomena? That's a little more of a basic research question. What does secure attachment look like at age 8? That's a little more of a basic research question. You're just trying to understand, what does that look like? If we observed it, what is happening here? What other variables are affecting it? How is it affecting other variables? What personality traits, so question 5, what personality traits make effective foster parents? So that's a little bit more applied. So that's kind of one of those that's a little on the edge. You're trying to describe things, but you're also looking at effective versus not effective. So that you might be coming up with some prescriptions there. So that's a little more applied. So you see, for this specific question, maybe the distinction isn't quite as clear, but I'd say it falls a little more on the applied side. And then the last one, what trainings build effective foster parents? So you're trying to actually do some kind of manipulation, some kind of training to change foster parents to be more effective. That's obviously applied. So hopefully that doesn't confuse you too much. We do have these distinctions of basic and applied, but from these, especially from question 5, you might see sometimes there's a little more overlap than we might have claimed earlier on in these slideshows. But before we jump into that, let's talk about evaluation research, because it's a different kind of research, and I thought this slide was supposed to come up one at a time, but that's okay. We'll run through it this way. So evaluation is often very, very focused on programs. So you might evaluate an entire company. This company might be trying to do some new kind of intervention to help their employees be happier or something like that. You might evaluate just that program. You might have a music program in a school district, so you'd evaluate that music program. Is it doing what you want it to do? You might have a specific kind of thing within a specific school, like does teaching music in this way, does that have an impact? So it's very, very focused on programs, sometimes focused on a problem that a program is intended to solve. It's very, very context dependent. So like I said, it might be a specific company, a specific school, a specific, say, policy that exists that you are trying to figure out, does this work or does it not? Oftentimes, rather than questions coming from a researcher, oftentimes an evaluator comes in with knowledge of research methods. So like I would come into a company or a school or something like the Heroic Imagination Project, for example, and they'd say, hey, we want to know, does X, Y, or Z work? And I would say, okay, so your questions are X, Y, and Z. Let's make those into research questions. Let's see, how could we measure it? What are you doing now? What could we do in the future to measure it? And make a plan to evaluate and figure out, does X, Y, Z work? Or is it doing what you want it to be doing? Things like that. So generally, the evaluator coming in isn't bringing the questions. They might modify the questions in a way that's easier to research, But usually those questions are coming from the stakeholders, the people involved in, say, the company or the school or whatever it is. So with this, evaluations are often very prescriptive, giving value judgments saying, hey, so your program, your HR program to help people increase productivity and increase their well-being, it's increasing their productivity, but their well-being is dropping. So you're giving them prescriptive decisions. So this worked well, this was an increase in well-being, but this did not work, so stop doing that. So you'll give them an evaluation report that's very prescriptive. Do this, do that, this is working, this is not. So with this, generally for evaluations, you're disseminating not to research journals or things like that. You're generally disseminating just to the stakeholders, so just to the people that generally hire you to do the evaluation. So let's say, for example, actually Sesame Street is a really good example of this, and PBS. PBS does a lot of evaluations of their programming to see if it's working and doing what they want it to be doing. So does Daniel Tiger cartoon help children with their emotion regulation? They will do an evaluation to see, and maybe some of that is experiments, maybe some of that is observation studies. So with that, and then as the evaluator, you will give your report, you will disseminate that just to the board who hired you, or PBS as a whole, and let them know, hey, this is working, this is not. Maybe you could change things this way in the future, and you give them recommendations. And then you, as the evaluator, you kind of step back and you're like, now it's up to you to make those changes or not, kind of thing. So it's a little bit different way of doing research. So you come in, you help do the research, and you're like, do this, do this, do this, and then it's out of your hands. They either do those things or they don't. So with that, with Sesame Street, with PBS shows, there's actually a lot of evaluation research in them. It's a little different too, because you can actually find some of those evaluation reports because it's PBS, it's public broadcasting. A lot of their evaluations are actually published. So you can find those evaluation reports and you can read them. But if, say, Apple, just as one example, a lot of bigger corporations will do a lot of evaluations, but those won't ever see, like public won't ever see those. They will do an internal evaluation, generally bring in some outside person to do the evaluation, and then just people within the company, maybe the specific level of managers or the specific kind of team that is working on this evaluation, will see those results, but nobody outside, no researchers will see those kinds of things. So that's often a big difference with evaluation research. You might make a research report for a company, and the 5 people at the company read it, and they decide to make changes or not make changes, but none of your work is ever seen by other people outside that. So it's not really focused on, say, basic research or adding to the knowledge base. It's trying to see, does this program work? Does it not? How does it work? How does it not? How can we change things in the future? So with this, evaluation is different than other research because often it involves a lot more human relations. So how are humans interacting with each other in a school setting, in a company setting? How does that evaluator, so you as an evaluator researcher, how do you interact with the stakeholders that want these questions answered? So you could come in and say, this is the only way we could do this, or you could work a little more collaboratively, or you could just do exactly what they tell you to, even if it's not good research methods. So it involves working with other people who have other goals and questions than you might have as a researcher coming in to evaluate. So with this, program evaluation is a big part of this. It's kind of a little bit synonymous. Developmental evaluation, which this is 2 things. So developmental evaluation is both like evaluating how things develop over time, and there's a specific kind of evaluation called developmental evaluation of like how do we monitor that change over time. There's also basic research in like how can we possibly do developmental evaluation and follow things and measure things well when things can change so dramatically from one year to another or from in 10 years. So there's, with evaluation, a lot of context dependent things, questions coming from the people who are in that company or business or something like that. Actually, a really good example of an evaluation question from a company is Disneyland. So in Disneyland, they have long lines. If you've ever been there, you've probably experienced that. And they've done evaluations of which kinds of lines do people perceive as shorter. Not how to shorten the lines, but how can we make or trick people to think the line is shorter than it is. And so one of the big things that they found was having the scenery change throughout the line. And so you'll see some of the newer rides will have like 3 or 4 like rooms or like areas you pass through before you ever get on the ride. And the more of that kind of change or interactivity along the line, people perceive it as shorter. So it's kind of an interesting thing that that evaluation made that kind of change, but that's not a paper that you can like go and search up. I mean, maybe that one is, I'm not sure. But yeah, that's an example of an evaluation question. Like, how do we make people think they're in line less time than they actually are? And they figured out what to do, and they've made those changes. So as an evaluator, that's what you want. You want them to make the changes you suggest. So now you're probably really confused. So was that study I just described about Disneyland, was that basic research? Was that applied research? Was that evaluation? In some ways, it doesn't really matter if it falls in the basic research, applied research, or evaluation camp, as long as you're doing good research methods. It's a big continuum, essentially. You might have specific studies that are very obviously exclusively basic research, that are just describing things, that are not focused on problems at all, just understanding how things work with each other. And then you might have an applied research that's really very focused on solving one specific problem in context. You might also have an evaluation that's only on this specific problem in this specific context from this specific company, and does this work or does it not? What changes should we make? So, right, there could be very exclusive, very separate things for basic research, applied research, and evaluation. But oftentimes, things fall somewhere in the middle. So this study here is a little more applied, but also a little bit evaluation. And that's how research really happens, is doing whatever is best. Do you need to do more basic research, applied research? Is it going to be more evaluation? So we do have these distinctions. They are different terms, but it is really more of a continuum or a Venn diagram where they're very overlapping in some ways. So depending on the study that you're doing, it might be more basic, might be more applied, might be very evaluation focused. And as you can see, evaluation here is kind of more overlapping on the applied research side and less overlapping on the basic research side. So with this, very often any study or program of studies, like whole set of studies, will not be intended to be applied. So while you're doing basic research, you might be doing research on how phenomenons are affecting each other. How does sugar affect diabetes, for example? So you're just doing basic research, you're not intending to apply that. But later researchers might say, oh, so these things are the most related to developing diabetes. Let's do applied research, see if by modulating those, see if doing an experiment and doing something like insulin or changing diets, if that will change symptoms of diabetes. So later researchers might realize, oh, that basic research can help solve this problem. So that's another way that these can kind of get confounded. The original researchers might have been doing basic research, but later researchers say, oh, this is a really good way to solve this problem. And then they would do an applied research study and actually test that. So in some ways, the determination of is it basic or applied research is down to the time you're looking at it at. So the applied research study that you do, the application might in the end figure out that it's not really that important. But the way that it related to other things, that might have a big impact on basic research in the future. So while we do have these distinctions, and I've literally spent however many minutes at this point talking about basic versus applied research, they are useful to distinguish, but in some ways basic research can be used in application later on. Applied research, we might find that it actually is more relevant as basic research. So it's really a cycle. So like this model that I showed you, it's a really big cycle. If we see something that we want to learn and do basic research on, we might learn about it. And then someone else might be like, oh, that can solve this problem or help us solve this problem. So the process of research is really a cycle. When we have any individual that wants to solve a problem or answer a question, they'll look at the research that's comes before. They'll talk to people who are working in that area. If that's within just psychology, or it's in sociology or anthropology or political science, right? They're going to spread out their network to talk to people who are knowledgeable about the subject, or they should be doing that anyway. And then hopefully we either solve problems or we're getting a better understanding of basic phenomenon. So that is kind of the cycle of research and how we do things. And with that, we'll make changes. We'll maybe realize, oh, we need to modify the theory. And so that might lead to paradigm shifts in the future. So that's kind of how the process of research works. And it's pretty neat, I think. I think it's a lot of fun to do this work of this cycle. So you might be doing the research, or in some cases I feel like I'm doing the research, we try something and it worked out really well, so we think, oh, we should try this too. So we should add this to it. And sometimes that piece doesn't work. So you have to go back a few steps and see, well, what did work, what didn't work. And so I think it's a really fun process to do this research and solve problems. That's why I do a lot of applied research that are really focused on changing things or manipulating things, whether it's pro-social behavior, helping people increase their purpose in life. Those are some of my big concerns that I like to do and make changes of. So with that, hopefully you have a better understanding of basic research and applied research. And remember that with this, while we do have these distinctions, and you should know some of these distinctions, like applied research is more problem focused, basic research is for knowledge sake. Those should be in your notes. You should know those distinctions. Do understand, hopefully, also that the process of research is a little more cyclical, is a little more messy than these really clear distinctions and differences that we're talking about here. All right. And that is chapter 7, right? Yeah, that was chapter 7. Right, yeah. So there you go, chapter 7, and basic and applied research.